Bob Dylan, the legendary singer-songwriter behind timeless hits like Blowin' in the Wind and Like a Rolling Stone, wasn't just a voice of a generation. He was also a man of mystery, passion, and romance. At the height of his fame, women came and went, drawn in by his charm, talent, and rebellious soul. But out of all the flings, affairs, and muses, there was one woman who stood apart from the rest. Why? Because she wasn't just another love interest, she was the love of his life. Dylan himself has admitted it. So who was she? What made her different? And why did this love leave such a mark on the man who always kept his heart so guarded? Stay tuned, because this is a story you won't want to miss. Humble beginnings. Before we reveal who the love of his life was, let's take a moment to remember the man behind the music. Bob Dylan is no doubt one of the greatest songwriters of all time. Everyone everywhere knows the name Bob Dylan, and for nearly 70 years, he's been more than just a musician. He's been a voice, a mirror, and sometimes a mystery. With over 125 million records sold around the world, Dylan isn't just one of the best-selling artists in history, he is a force in popular culture, shaping it in ways few others ever have. But before he was Bob Dylan, he was Robert Allen Zimmerman, born on May 24, 1941, in St. Mary's Hospital, Duluth, Minnesota. His Hebrew name was Shabtai Zizel ben Avraham. He came from a line of Jewish immigrants. His father's parents, Anna Kyrgyz and Zygmunt Zimmerman, fled Odessa after the 1905 pogroms against Jews in the Russian Empire, now part of Ukraine. His mother's parents, Florence and Ben Stone, arrived from Lithuania in 1902. Dylan once wrote that his paternal grandmother's family had even deeper roots, from the Kazman district in northeastern Turkey. His parents, Abram Zimmerman and Beatrice Beatty Stone, raised him in a small, close-knit Jewish community. They lived in Duluth until Dylan was 6, but when his father was struck by polio, the family moved to Beatty's hometown of Hibbing. That's where Dylan grew up, surrounded by mining dust and small-town quiet, while his dad and uncles ran a furniture and appliance store. In the 1950s, Dylan found a world beyond Hibbing. Through the radio. The Grand Ole Opry introduced him to Hank Williams, whose voice, he later said, went through me like an electric rod. He fell hard for the emotion in Johnny Ray's music, too. He was the first singer whose voice and style I totally fell in love with, Dylan admitted. I loved his style, wanted to dress like him, too. Soon he discovered rock and roll, tuning into stations from Shreveport and Little Rock. The sound was wild, new, and alive. At Hibbing High School, Dylan started forming bands, the most known being the Golden Chords. They played Little Richard and Elvis Presley covers so loud during a school show that the principal cut the mic. But Dylan wasn't bothered. He was chasing something bigger. Then, in January 1959, everything clicked. A 17-year-old Dylan stood in the crowd at the Duluth Armory and watched Buddy Holly perform, just 4 days before the tragic plane crash that took Holly's life. Dylan never forgot it. In his Nobel Prize lecture decades later, he called Holly the archetype, everything I wasn't and wanted to be. That same year, Dylan's high school yearbook printed a line beneath his photo, Robert Zimmerman to join Little Richard. He was serious. That year, he performed under the name Elston Gunn. Yes, with 3 N's, and even played piano for Bobby V on a couple of gigs. In September 1959, Dylan left Hibbing for the University of Minnesota, but he wasn't there for lectures. He lived in the Sigma Alpha Mu House, a Jewish fraternity, and started playing gigs at a nearby coffee house called the 10 O'Clock Scholar. In the Dinkytown neighborhood of Minneapolis, Dylan began his real education, deep in the local folk scene. He drifted from rock and roll. It wasn't enough, he explained years later. Great catchphrases and rhythms. But the songs weren't serious. They didn't reflect life. Folk music was different. It had weight. It had sadness. It had faith, struggle, and truth. He dove in. And somewhere in that smoky folk scene, Robert Zimmerman began calling himself Bob Dylan. He once considered Dylan, but after reading some poems by Dylan Thomas, The spelling felt right. The name stuck. He never looked back. In a 2004 interview, Dylan summed it up like this: "You're born, you know, with the wrong names, wrong parents. I mean, that happens. You call yourself what you want to call yourself. This is the land of the free." And so, before the world knew his songs, before the protests and poetry, before the Nobel and the myth, there was a boy with a radio, a borrowed name, and a fire that couldn't be dimmed. The road to stardom. By May 1960, Dylan had dropped out of college. 1 year later, he was on a Greyhound bus heading to New York City with nothing but a guitar, a harmonica, and a mission. He wasn't there to chase fame. Not yet. He came to see a man who had changed his life. Woody Guthrie. Guthrie was sick, dying slowly in a psychiatric hospital in New Jersey. But to Dylan, he was the living heartbeat of American folk music. Guthrie's songs weren't just tunes. They were stories, struggles, and the soul of the country. Dylan later said, "I was going to be Guthrie's greatest disciple." New York in the early 60s was gritty, loud, and buzzing with music. Dylan dove right into the Greenwich Village folk scene, playing in smoky clubs and tiny cafes. He made fast friends and learnt fast. He picked up songs, techniques, and influences from legends like Dave Van Ronk, Odetta, Fred Neil, and even Irish folk greats like the Clancy Brothers. His sound was taking shape, raw, urgent, and unmistakably him. Then came the big break. In September 1961, the New York Times ran a glowing review of Dylan's show at Gerde's Folk City, calling him a distinctive folk song stylist. That review lit the fuse. That same month, Dylan played harmonica on a session for folk singer Carolyn Hester, a small gig that changed everything. Her producer, John Hammond, noticed him and signed Dylan to Columbia Records. And just like that, Dylan was in the studio. His first album, Bob Dylan, dropped in March 1962. It was mostly covers, traditional folk, blues, and gospel, with just 2 original tracks, Talkin' New York and Song to Woody. It didn't make a splash, selling just 5,000 copies, but Columbia stuck with him. John Hammond saw something. That August, Dylan made it official, legally changing his name to Robert Dylan at the St. Louis County Court, back in Hibbing. His father was there as a witness. A new identity for a new path. Then he signed with Albert Grossman, a tough, sharp manager who believed in Dylan and protected him like a hawk. Grossman stayed by Dylan's side through most of the wild 1960s, helping shape his image, deals, and rise to fame. In December 1962, Dylan flew to the UK for the first time, invited to appear in a BBC television play called Madhouse on Castle Street. It was here that he performed Blowin' in the Wind publicly for one of the first times. He also played in small London folk clubs and soaked in the local sounds, learning from artists like Martin Carthy, who introduced him to traditional British ballads that would later echo through his own work. But it was in May 1963, with the release of his second album, The Freewheelin' Bob Dylan, that the world began to listen. Really listen. This was the album that changed everything. Songs like Blowin' in the Wind, A Hard Rain's A-Gonna Fall, and Masters of War were bold, biting, and unafraid. Dylan wasn't just a singer anymore. He was a voice. His songs tackled war, injustice, and civil rights, the kind of topics that mattered. They weren't safe. They were urgent. They were protest songs with poetry. Some people couldn't handle his voice because it was rough, nasal, and untrained. But that was the point. It cut through the noise. Author Joyce Carol Oates once wrote that hearing Dylan for the first time was as if sandpaper could sing. It was strange, yes, but it was electric. And when others started covering his songs, the world began to catch on. Joan Baez, already a star in the folk world, became both his champion and his lover. She recorded his songs. She brought him on stage. She introduced him to her fans. With her support, his words reached millions. Around the same time, bands like the Byrds, the Hollies, Sonny and Cher, and Manfred Mann turned Dylan's songwriting into hits. Suddenly, Dylan's voice was everywhere, sometimes sung by others, but unmistakably his. The Bob Dylan controversy. Bob Dylan isn't just one of the greatest songwriters of all time, he's also one of the most controversial. From his early days in the smoky folk clubs of Greenwich Village to his explosive live performances on the world stage, Dylan's career has been a long dance with both praise and outrage. That dance picked up a new rhythm in late 2024, when the biopic A Complete Unknown hit theaters. Starring Timothée Chalamet as Dylan, the film earned critical acclaim and award season buzz, especially after Chalamet snagged Best Actor at the SAG Awards. But it wasn't just about the music. A Complete Unknown, based on Elijah Wald's book Dylan Goes Electric, pulled back the curtain on some of Dylan's most defining and divisive moments. The most controversial scene? The infamous 1965 Newport Folk Festival. By then, Dylan had already become the voice of a generation, a young, wiry folk poet with a harmonica, an acoustic guitar, and a gift for telling uncomfortable truths. But behind the scenes, Dylan was growing restless. He was tired of being boxed in as a folk prophet. He wanted to experiment, evolve, and amplify. So, he plugged in. At Newport, Dylan walked on stage with a full electric band and tore into a set that would go down in history. The crowd didn't cheer. They booed. Folk fans felt betrayed. To them, Dylan wasn't just changing his sound, he was turning his back on everything they thought he stood for. That moment marked the start of what would be called the Electric Dylan controversy. Albums like Bringing It All Back Home and Highway 61 Revisited, featuring the anthemic Like a Rolling Stone, cemented Dylan's shift toward electric rock. And while the music was brilliant, it was polarizing. A year later, things escalated again on tour. During a concert in England, an audience member stood up and shouted, "Judas!" at Dylan, comparing his artistic pivot to the ultimate betrayal. It was loud, it was ugly, and it was unforgettable. Dylan didn't flinch. He simply turned to his band and said, "Play it loud." That was Dylan, always one step ahead, always pushing the edge. But the controversy didn't stop with music. In 2016, Dylan shocked the literary world when he was awarded the Nobel Prize in Literature, putting him in the same company as Toni Morrison, Orhan Pamuk, Han Kang, and Albert Einstein. The Swedish Academy honored him for having created new poetic expressions within the great American song tradition. It was the first time a songwriter had ever won the prize. To some, it was long overdue. To others, it felt like a stretch, even an insult, to lifelong novelists and poets. Critics argued that Dylan, while a genius with lyrics, didn't belong in the same category as literary heavyweights. And just like that, another Dylan debate erupted. Is songwriting literature? Should a musician win the world's highest literary honor? But Dylan, ever the enigma, didn't show up to accept the award. He sent a speech instead, understated, poetic, and perfectly Dylan. Through all of it, the boos, the insults, the awards, the adoration, Bob Dylan has remained untouchably himself. He's a man of contradictions, folk hero and rock star, recluse and provocateur, poet and puzzle. His controversies haven't just shaped his legacy, they've become his legacy. In the end, maybe that's what makes Dylan so captivating. He never played it safe, and in doing so, he changed music and culture forever. Though Dylan has come out on the other side of the many controversies unscathed, there is one accusation that almost derailed his career. The accusations against Dylan. Not every story about Dylan is written in melody. Some are written in court filings. In 2022, a woman identified only as JC filed a shocking lawsuit against Bob Dylan, claiming that the legendary musician had sexually abused her in 1965 when she was just 12 years old. According to the suit, Dylan used his fame and influence to drug and intoxicate her during a 6-week period at New York's iconic Chelsea Hotel. The the same place where many of Dylan's artistic and romantic escapades reportedly took place. JC alleged he had assaulted her multiple times and used threats of physical violence to keep her silent. She accused him of assault, battery, false imprisonment, and infliction of emotional distress, saying the events caused her severe psychological trauma that affected her entire life. The complaint was filed just before the deadline under New York's Child Victims Act, which had opened a temporary window for historical abuse claims. But as serious as the accusations were, the timeline itself raised immediate doubts. According to Dylan's official tour history, personal biographies, and the 1967 documentary Don't Look Back, Dylan was on tour in the UK from late April to May 10, 1965, and then in France and Portugal until early June. These dates directly conflicted with JC's account. Dylan's legal team called the case a lawyer-driven sham and vowed to fight it vigorously. They maintained the allegations were false, malicious, and made for money. Soon, it became clear the case was crumbling. Dylan's attorneys accused JC of destroying key evidence, and Manhattan federal judge Catherine Polk Fila dismissed the case with prejudice, meaning it is permanently closed and cannot be refiled. "This case is over," Dylan's attorney said. "It is outrageous that it was ever brought in the first place." JC's lawyers did not respond publicly to the dismissal. Despite the lack of a conviction or even a trial, the lawsuit was a jarring chapter in Dylan's long and complex legacy. For many fans, it forced a moment of pause. Dylan, whose career has been defined by songs of protest, truth, rebellion, and romantic mystery, was suddenly at the center of a story that felt like the antithesis of everything he once seemed to represent. Yet Dylan carried on, just as he always has. In 2023, he released Shadow Kingdom, a moody reimagining of his earlier songs, and continued his Rough and Rowdy Ways worldwide tour, an extension of the decades-long never-ending tour. Now in his 80s, Dylan remains a myth in motion. He's a man who has sung of justice and injustice, love and loss, freedom and fate, and now of rumor and reckoning. A writer of countless love songs and at least one courtroom saga. Bob Dylan's first love. Just like his music, Bob Dylan's love life was chaotic, charged, and full of tangled verses. Over the course of his adult life, Dylan has had at least 14 confirmed romantic relationships, and many of them overlapped. Affairs, muses, heartbreaks, it was all there, often unfolding at the same time the world was watching him rise as a generational voice. One of the most talked about love triangles involves two women portrayed in a complete unknown, the recent biopic. In the film, Dylan is shown getting involved with both Joan Baez and Sylvie Rousseau, the character based on Suze Rotolo. And yes, it's true. Dylan was seeing Joan while still living with Suze. It wasn't subtle, it wasn't hidden, it just was. But what the movie doesn't show is that these two were far from the only ones. Before Joan and Suze, before New York, before Greenwich Village, there was Echo Hellstrom, Dylan's first love. Back in Hibbing, Minnesota, when he was still Robert Zimmerman, the two were high school seniors. They dated for about a year between 1958 and 1959. She drove a car, wore her hair in a signature bouffant, and introduced Dylan to poetry, literature, and music outside the radio hits. She helped shape his early taste, even if their romance never lasted. She may have also inspired one of Dylan's most haunting early songs, Girl from the North Country. He never confirmed it, but the timing lines up, and the longing in the lyrics feels personal. Still, others have pointed out that her high school photo didn't match the imagery of the song. Whatever the truth, Echo was the first serious girlfriend and the first heartbreak. Then came New York, and with it, Suze Rotolo. But before Suze Rotolo, there was Bonnie Beecher. Bob Dylan and Bonnie Beecher. Before New York swallowed him whole, Bonnie Beecher had his attention. They met at the University of Minnesota in 1959. She was an actor. He was just Bob Zimmerman, still figuring out who he was and who he wasn't. They dated for about a year, and many believe Bonnie, not Echo Hellstrom, is the woman behind Girl from the North Country. She had the look, she had the presence, and she stayed in his life longer than people realize. Even after Dylan dropped out and headed to New York, they stayed in touch. When he returned to Minnesota for Christmas in 1961, they reunited, and something remarkable happened. Inside Bonnie's house, Dylan recorded a batch of demos, raw blues, gospel, and folk tracks. It was one of his earliest known sessions, and though it was never officially released, those tapes have been passed around for decades. That moment, that house holds a key piece of Dylan's early sound. But if Bonnie was the quiet muse, Suze Rotolo was the storm. Bob Dylan and Suze Rotolo. Dylan fell hard and fast. In Chronicles, he doesn't hold back. She was the most erotic thing I'd ever seen. Suze wasn't just a love interest. She changed the way Dylan thought. She was deep in civil rights activism and introduced him to political art and protest. Her passion sparked something in him. It's no coincidence that after meeting her, Dylan's writing turned sharper, louder, and more urgent. She also believed in his voice. The film A Complete Unknown shows her encouraging him to write his own songs, and that part's rooted in truth. But their love didn't last. They became icons together on the cover of the Freewheelin' Bob Dylan, 1963. Strolling through snowy streets, her clinging to his arm. To the world, it looked like romance. Behind the scenes, it was unraveling. Suze had an abortion, and Dylan was falling into the arms of Joan Baez. When Suze found out about this, the betrayal broke her. The two broke up in 1964. Dylan wrote about it the only way he knew how, in song. Don't think twice, it's all right. Tomorrow is a long time. Boots of Spanish leather. One too many mornings. And the bitter ballad in plain D. Years later, Suze wrote a memoir, A Freewheelin' Time, giving her side of the story. She kept her distance from the spotlight until her death in 2011 at 67. And Dylan? Out of all the women he loved and lost, it's Suze's name he still won't speak lightly of. Suze was the real love of his life. Even in the movie, her character's name was changed. A quiet nod to a love that ran deep, even after it burnt out. Bob Dylan's folk flame. Joan Baez. Joan Baez wasn't just Dylan's lover, she was his mirror. They met in the New York folk scene in 1961. She was already a star, her haunting soprano shaking the rafters. Dylan was still playing coffee shops and chasing Guthrie's ghost, but Baez saw something in him. By 1963, the roles were reversed. Dylan was becoming the voice of a generation, and she invited him to share her spotlight at the Newport Folk Festival. They sang duets, marched with Martin Luther King Jr., and turned protest into poetry. Offstage, their chemistry flared. Their romance began as their performances multiplied, and just like that, Suze Rotolo was out. Baez was in. But their fire didn't last long. By 1965, Dylan had traded protest songs for electric guitars, and Baez found herself left backstage. Quite literally. Dylan invited her on tour, then barely acknowledged her presence. She waited night after night for a call to join him on stage that never came. Meanwhile, Dylan was already entangled with Sarah Lowndes, a fashion model who was pregnant with his child and soon to become his secret wife. That betrayal stung, but Joan Baez never disappeared. She came back for Dylan's Rolling Thunder review, joined his chaotic film Ronaldo and Clara, and even toured with him again in the 80s. By 1984, she walked off the tour early, tired of being sidelined. Still, the bond never truly broke. Baez immortalized him in her 1975 song Diamonds and Rust, a poetic gut punch about getting a call from Dylan 10 years after he left her heart in pieces. Dylan, in turn, may have written To Ramona, She Belongs to Me, and Visions of Johanna, with Baez in mind. Years later, Dylan finally said what he never could back then. Joan Baez is as tough-minded as they come. Love. And she's a free, independent spirit, a woman with devastating honesty. And for her kind of love and devotion, I could never pay that back. Mavis Staples. Then came the gospel and the girl who made him think about forever. At the 1964 Newport Folk Festival, Dylan met Mavis Staples, lead singer of the Staple Singers. Her voice was thunder and velvet. He was hooked, enough to propose marriage. Mavis thought he was joking. Maybe he was. Maybe he wasn't. But the moment stuck. They shared a kiss, or as Mavis put it, a smooch, and maybe more. What's certain is they stayed close. Dylan adored her, called her baby for years, and Mavis later admitted, "We may have smooched more than once." It never became a full-blown romance, but in a life crowded with complicated women, Mavis was the calm, the what if, the kind of love that didn't burn down the house. The affair? Sarah Dillon wasn't a song, she was the whole album. By 1964, Dylan's world was spinning fast. Fame, fire, and the fallout from Joan Baez and Suze Rotolo. In the middle of it all, quietly, came Sarah Lowndes. She was mysterious, married, elegant, a former model with a daughter from her previous marriage, and a look in her eyes Dylan couldn't shake. While Baez lit the stage beside him, Dylan began sneaking off to the Hotel Chelsea, where he and Sarah began their clandestine affair. The scene in A Complete Unknown, where Dylan visits Baez at the hotel, that's really Sarah's story, ghost-written for cinema. In November 1965, Dylan married Sarah in secret. She was already pregnant. A year later, he crashed his motorcycle and vanished from public view. The world thought he was healing. In truth, he was settling down. With Sarah, he lived the closest thing to a quiet life, tucked away in Woodstock, New York, raising a family. They had 5 children together, including Jakob Dylan, who would later front the Wallflowers. Dylan wrote to the world, but he wrote for Sarah. She was his muse, his anchor, his mystery. But even anchors drift. By 1975, the marriage was crumbling. Dylan tried to hold it together with a song, Sarah, the final track on his Desire album. He sang it like a prayer. I can still hear the sound of the Methodist bells. I had taken the cure and had just gotten through, staying up for days in the Chelsea Hotel, writing Sad-Eyed Lady of the Lowlands for you. It wasn't enough. They divorced in 1977. Still, unlike many of Dylan's muses, Sarah never spoke publicly. She never sold her story. She became the myth behind the myth. And today, they're said to be on peaceful terms, bonded not just by memories, but by 5 lives they built together. But even after Sarah, Dylan didn't stay still. In 1965, the same year he married Sarah, Dylan crossed paths with Dana Gillespie, a teenage blues singer in London. She was 16, he was 24, and famous beyond comprehension. They met at a press conference, and hours later, were tangled in a hotel room haze. He was a bit of a boyfriend, Gillespie recalled, decades later. Vague, but enough. Sally Kirkland was next. Actress, activist, wild heart. They met in the mid-70s when she tagged along with the Rolling Thunder Revue. She and Dylan had a brief but real fling on and off stage. I loved him, Kirkland would later say, and he was complicated. Then came Faridi McFree, not a singer or an actress, but an art therapist. She helped Dylan's children work through the turbulence of divorce. Before long, she and Dylan had a quiet relationship of their own, stretching from 1977 into 1978. McFree painted Dylan constantly, abstract works full of longing and light. Her love didn't make it into lyrics, but it lived in brushstrokes. Some of those paintings still hang in galleries today. From high school halls in Hibbing to the Chelsea Hotel to backstage at Newport, Dylan's love life wasn't linear. It was lyrical. Bob Dylan has always been a master of words, but sometimes it's the quiet, heartfelt confessions that speak the loudest. Thank you for watching. And if this story moved you, Don't forget to like, subscribe, and share your thoughts in the comments below.